For years, I felt like my son simply ignored me. It wasn't something that happened overnight. It was a slow, silent process. At first, it was small things. He stopped responding enthusiastically, seemed annoyed when I called, or postponed our visits with excuses that sounded kind but felt cold. Then, the silences grew longer. Calls went unanswered. Messages were read but not replied to. And finally, the forgetting. I remember sitting in the living room, phone in hand, staring at the screen, waiting for it to ring, waiting for a sign. How are you, Mum? I miss you, Dad. But it never came. And when we finally talked, his voice was distant, as if fulfilling an obligation. I spoke with love, eagerness, need. He answered with monosyllables. And I won't lie to you, it hurt. I felt invisible to the person I had loved the most, protected the most. I thought about all the sleepless nights, the sacrifices, the moments I gave my all for him. And I didn't understand. What did I do wrong? When did he stop caring? But what was hardest to accept was this truth. I couldn't force him to love me like before. The only thing I could do was change myself. For a long time, I thought I had to do more to get his attention back. That if I called more, if I was kinder, if I made things easier for him, he would come back. But nothing worked. Until one day, out of exhaustion, sadness, or maybe accumulated wisdom, I stopped chasing. And in that moment, everything began to change. Today I want to share with you 4 simple rules that, applied with calm, patience, and dignity, completely changed my relationship with my son. It wasn't magic, it wasn't overnight, but it was real. If you also feel your son is ignoring you, if every conversation leaves you emptier than before, if you've lost the connection with the one you love most, this video is for you. I'm not here to give you perfect formulas. I'm here to tell you what worked for me. Because if it brought me peace, maybe it can bring you peace too. Before we start, tell me something in the comments. How old are you and where are you watching from? I'll love to read you. Now, let's go with the first rule. Tag. Rule 1. Stop begging for attention. I would wake up wondering if I had bothered him with something. I went to bed checking if he had seen my message. If he replied with a cold word, I spent the day analyzing what I'd done wrong. I offered to help with everything. Watch his kids, lend him money, do favors. I was always available, always saying yes, even though inside I was exhausted, frustrated, or sad. And the most painful thing was this. The harder I tried, the less he looked at me. It was as if my presence no longer mattered, as if giving him everything wasn't enough. Or worse, as if I had become invisible. No matter how much love I gave, how much I offered, how much I sacrificed, nothing seemed to move him, and instead of bringing us closer, each effort I made pushed him farther away. I convinced myself it was my fault, that I had to do even more, that maybe I was being too pushy, or too absent, or too something. And so I entered an exhausting cycle, where I gave everything I had, waiting for a reaction, a sign of affection, the smallest gesture. And he just kept living his life, without including me. One day, after writing him 3 times without a reply, something inside me broke. I felt ridiculous. I felt small. And in that instant, I understood one of the harshest but most necessary truths. Love is not begged for. Neither is respect, nor attention. When you have to chase something, it probably isn't there for you anymore, or you're not meant to keep chasing it. And no, it wasn't easy to accept. Because as a mother, as a father, you are programmed to give endlessly. But there is an invisible line that, once crossed, is no longer love. It's dependence. And that dependence makes us lose dignity. Do you know what I discovered? That begging for attention doesn't create connection. It creates rejection. Because when someone feels you desperately need their affection, their validation, their presence, they stop valuing you. They no longer see you as a person, but as an emotional burden. And that is devastating. So I made a decision. I stopped chasing him, and I started respecting myself. I stopped texting him every day. I stopped offering myself for everything. I stopped adjusting to his life as if mine didn't matter. And most importantly, I stopped waiting for him. I started putting my attention on myself, on rebuilding myself. And you know what happened? At first, nothing. He didn't notice the change, or he didn't want to notice. But little by little, his attitude began to change. He wrote to ask how I was. He called, maybe out of habit, maybe out of curiosity. And that small gesture was the beginning of something new. The first big lesson is this. When you stop chasing, you start attracting. When you respect yourself, you teach others how to treat you. You're not in this world to beg for love, to plead for attention. You are here to share love, but only with those who know how to receive it with gratitude. Now tell me, have you ever felt like you give too much and get nothing back? Have you felt like you're running after someone who doesn't want to be caught? If so, maybe today is the day you start walking in another direction, toward yourself. How I applied Rule 1 in real life. Making the decision to stop begging for attention was just the first step. The hard part came after, actually applying it day by day. I was used to sending him messages every morning. "Good morning, son. How are you?" I called on weekends, even though he almost never answered. I constantly offered help, even when he didn't ask. "Do you want me to watch the kids? Do you need me to lend you some money?" I was always looking for ways to be useful, thinking if he needed me, he would value me. But none of that worked. So I started with the simplest and hardest thing. I stopped texting him first. I promised myself I wouldn't send messages every day, not because I didn't love him, but because I needed to regain my inner peace. If he wanted to talk, he could. He had my number. He knew where to find me. I also stopped doing favors without being asked. If he called in a hurry, saying he needed me to watch his kids that same day, before I would have said yes without thinking. This time I said, "I can't today. I already had other plans." Even if those plans were simply to rest, read, or take a walk. I didn't have to justify myself. My time mattered too. And most importantly, I stopped being emotionally available for everything. When I noticed he only talked to me to vent, to unload his stress without asking how I was, I no longer accepted it the same way. I didn't hang up or judge, but I set boundaries. I calmly said, "We can talk, of course, but I also need you to listen to me." At first, his reaction was what I expected. Surprise. You could hear it in his voice. "Are you okay?" he asked, as if it was strange I wasn't calling him as much. Then came confusion. Instead of replying as usual, he said things like, "Are you upset?" or "Is something wrong?" And later, as days passed, came curiosity. One day he wrote me without me reaching out first. "How are you, Mom?" He called another day just to tell me a story without asking for a favor. And little by little, without me forcing it, he began to seek me out. That's when I understood the silent power of self-respect. You don't need to shout. You don't need to demand. Sometimes, just stepping back one step is enough. Just stop chasing. Because when you do, you leave space for the other to move toward you as well. And that's how I lived it. When I stopped looking for him, he started looking for me. It wasn't immediate, it wasn't magic, but it was true. And that's why I want you to remember this phrase I repeated many times during that process. Distance gave me back my dignity. Stepping back a little wasn't abandoning him. It was protecting myself. It was showing him, without harsh words, without reproaches, that I also deserve to be seen, heard, and valued. Sometimes, love needs a little space to breathe. And when you give it that space, what's real finds its way back. Tag. Rule 2. Find your voice without yelling. For a long time, when my son spoke to me with indifference or interrupted me, I tried to explain how it made me feel. I told him over and over, "It hurts that you don't call me. I don't like how you treat me. Why don't you include me in your life anymore?" But the more I talked, the less he listened. The more explanations I gave, the more ignored I felt. There were times frustration got the best of me. I got upset, raised my voice, and ended up saying things I didn't mean. Not with hatred, not without love, but with tiredness, with sadness. And unintentionally, I pushed him even further away. Because sometimes when we yell, the other person doesn't hear the message, but the overwhelming emotion behind it. Until one day, I understood something that changed how I communicated. You don't need to speak louder. You need to speak more firmly. That was the key. My mistake wasn't how I felt, but how I expressed it. I thought if I insisted enough, if I made myself heard by force, he would finally understand. But all I achieved was sounding like a constant complaint. One more voice in the noise. I learned that respect isn't demanded with volume, it's earned with presence. And presence isn't built by shouting, but by calm. I started speaking less, but with more intention. When something hurt me, I didn't make a drama, didn't cry on the phone, didn't send long messages. I said simple, clear things in a calm voice. What you said didn't seem respectful. I'm not available to be spoken to like that. I love you very much, but I love myself too. And then I stayed silent. Because I understood that not everything needs discussion. Sometimes the most impactful thing is the silence that follows a truth said with firmness. I also changed my attitude. I started looking him in the eyes, holding my ground without lowering my head. Not from confrontation, but from confidence. From the clarity of someone who knows what they deserve. And that small change shifted the entire dynamic. He could no longer mock, interrupt, or minimize my words as easily. Because I was no longer in begging mode, I was in presence mode. And presence commands respect. I learned that you don't have to convince anyone. You don't have to justify every emotion. You're not obligated to prove anything. Finding my voice was simply starting to speak from a place of calm, conviction, and healthy boundaries. If you have ever felt forced to repeat yourself again and again, trying to be understood, if you have ever ended a conversation feeling guilty, exhausted, or invisible, then this rule is for you. Speak less, more calmly, but with all your clarity. Because when you take yourself seriously, the world starts to listen differently. Chunk. How I applied Rule 2 without breaking the relationship. I clearly remember the moment I decided to apply this rule for the first time. It wasn't planned or rehearsed, but it was one of those moments when you just feel you can't go on the same way. We were on a video call. I was telling him something simple, an anecdote from my day. And he, without looking at the camera, interrupted me mid-sentence to answer a message on his phone. Then, hurriedly, he said, "Mom, I don't have time for this right now, okay? We'll talk later." And he hung up. I felt a hollow in my chest. Not because of the interruption, but because of the contempt disguised as haste. Before, I would have spent the rest of the day sad, and the next day I would have called him again like nothing happened. But that time, no. I took a deep breath and told myself, I don't need to yell to be heard. I just need to speak firmly. So I sent him a short message, without complaint, without reproach, but with all the dignity I was recovering. I know you're busy, but I deserve respect when I speak. You don't have to agree with me, but I ask you not to speak to me with contempt. I won't accept it anymore. I sent it and turned off the phone, not to punish him, but to protect myself. I prepared for any reaction, silence, anger, excuses, but not to argue. I had said what I needed to say, calmly, clearly, and from a firm place. 2 days passed without response. On the third, he called me. "Are you okay?" he asked. "Yes, I just needed to set a boundary," I replied. There was an awkward silence. I could feel his discomfort, his confusion, but also, behind that, his reflection. He told me he hadn't realized how he made me feel, that he thought I wasn't taking it seriously. And there I understood. I had taught him for years that everything was fine, even when it wasn't. That he could interrupt me, treat me with haste, not reply, and I would still be there, available, smiling, accommodating. But not this time. This time I didn't argue, I didn't yell, I didn't cry. I just spoke my truth, and then stayed silent. That surprised him, because I wasn't the begging mother, but the woman who sets limits with peace. Because I wasn't seeking his approval, but showing what I was starting to allow myself. Respect. Was there tension? Yes. Was it easy? No. But shortly after, he started listening more, not interrupting me, staying quiet when I spoke, responding with more than monosyllables. Little by little, he began to treat me like a person with her own voice. And that, though it seems small, was a huge victory. So, if you feel your words aren't heard, your opinions carry no weight, your presence has become invisible, I invite you to try this rule. It's not about imposing, it's about stopping begging. And when you stop arguing and start speaking with dignity, the other person is forced to pause and look. And sometimes, that pause is all that's needed to start healing. Rule 3. Stop being emotionally dependent on your child. I'm going to be completely honest with you. For a long time, my mood depended on one single gesture. A message, a call, a visit from my son. If he wrote me, the day was good. If he didn't, I spent the afternoon in silence, with that knot in my chest. If he said, "I love you," I felt valuable. If he forgot me, I felt like I meant nothing. I lived glued to the phone, to his availability, to his mood. And without realizing it, I had put the power to decide how I felt every day in his hands. It's hard to admit, because as a mother or father, you always believe you give out of love, without expecting anything. But it wasn't true. I expected. I expected a lot. I expected to be heard, to be prioritized, to be included. And when that didn't happen, I broke down emotionally. Until one day, after a whole week without hearing from him, I looked at myself in the mirror and asked a difficult but necessary question. Why have I given my emotional peace to another person? And there I saw the root of the problem. I had made my son the center of my world. I had placed him as the source of my joy, my motivation, even my purpose. But he had his life, his responsibilities, his rhythms. He couldn't, nor should he, be responsible for filling my emptiness. My son is not responsible for my happiness. I am, and that changed everything. I started with small things. I went for a walk every morning without looking at my phone. I started reading the books I had abandoned. I dared to pick up painting again, something I loved in my youth. I joined a group of older people sharing their stories, and for the first time in years, I talked about myself without mentioning him. I rediscovered parts of myself that had been asleep. I began to feel full inside, not because of what he gave me, but because of what I was giving myself. And the most curious thing happened afterward. When I stopped expecting him, he started looking for me more. When I was no longer glued to the phone, he started calling more often. When my world no longer revolved around him, he became interested in mine. The paradox was painful and beautiful at the same time. When I stopped needing him, he began to value me more. Because people, even without realizing it, move away from those who convey emotional dependence. No one wants to be the pillar of another's stability. It's a weight that tires, that pushes away. But when they see you happy, busy, fulfilled, they respect you. they admire you, they miss you. If you're also waiting for a call to feel okay, if your child's silence hurts like rejection, I invite you to look inward. Ask yourself, what can I do today for myself without depending on anyone else? What part of me has been waiting, paused, for years? Return to yourself. Because when you fill yourself with life, you don't just heal, you also teach others how to treat you. How I rebuilt my identity beyond being a mother. For years, being a mother was my greatest pride, and also my only definition. Everything revolved around my son, his schedules, his problems, his achievements, his presence, or worse, his absence. When he was little, he needed me for everything. But over time, naturally, he grew up. He became independent, busy, distant, and I, without realizing it, stayed stuck in a role that no longer had a stage. I was still a mother, yes, but I was no longer the protagonist of his life. And that's when the emptiness began. I spent a long time feeling like something was missing. But it wasn't him. It was me. I had forgotten who I was without the title of mother. My hobbies, my friendships, my little dreams, all left behind. So I decided to do something that was very hard for me, to rebuild myself. I started with the simplest, picking up activities I liked before being a mother. I went back to walking for pleasure, not just health. I signed up for a writing course at my neighborhood cultural center. I dared to attend a literary cafe alone. At first I felt out of place, but then, little by little, I started enjoying my own company. I made new friends, people who didn't know me as someone's mom, but simply as Elena. With them, I talked about books, recipes, movies, life, without mentioning my son every 5 minutes. And it was liberating. I set small goals: read 1 book per month, keep a plant alive, something I had never managed, learn to cook something new without a recipe. And every little achievement was proof that I could still grow, still learn, still enjoy. The most curious thing was that, in parallel, my relationship with my son began to change. I no longer called him desperately. I no longer waited for weekends like they were oxygen. And that gave him something I never imagined: space to miss me. He started asking what I was reading, how the writing class was going, if I had finally made my rose bush bloom. Because suddenly, I had a life of my own to share. A life that didn't need him to exist, but where there was still room for him. And then I understood. Stopping dependence isn't stopping love. It's loving from freedom. It's letting go of holding on and starting to invite. It's releasing expectations and opening the door to a healthier, more adult, more mutual connection. If today you feel like you don't know who you are outside your role as a mother or father, if it's hard for you to talk about yourself without talking about your children, I want to tell you this from my heart. You still have time to find yourself, not to replace your role, but to enrich it from a new place. Your identity doesn't end where parenting ends. That's actually where a new version of you begins, one that deserves to be discovered. Rule 4. Learn to set boundaries without threats. For a long time, I confused firmness with confrontation. I believed that if I wanted my son to change his attitude, I had to make it clear, harshly, that I wouldn't keep tolerating it. And of course, that usually ended badly. Arguments, yelling, distance. I ended up crying, he ended up colder, and everything stayed the same or worse, until I understood something that completely changed me. Setting boundaries isn't punishing, it's self-care. A punishment is loaded with anger. If you talk to me like that, I won't call you again. A threat seeks to control. At this rate, you'll be alone when I die. But a well-set limit is clear, respectful, and doesn't need shouting. One day, after a call where my son used a sarcastic tone and cut me off while I was speaking, I felt that mix of sadness and anger I had swallowed so many times. But this time, I did something different. I sent a short message. No reproaches, no drama, No manipulation. Son, the way you spoke to me today hurt. I'm willing to talk when there is respect. Not before. Whenever you want. I'll be here. And I turned off the phone. It was one of the hardest decisions I made, and one of the most liberating. I wasn't punishing him. I wasn't manipulating him. I was choosing not to expose myself to contempt. That's what setting boundaries without threats means. Establishing from where you're willing to relate, without needing to attack or justify yourself. Meaning, I'm not available for calls where I feel humiliated. I won't participate in conversations where my feelings are ridiculed. I can accept that you think differently, but not that you speak to me with contempt. And most importantly, uphold that decision with dignity. If the conversation becomes disrespectful, you walk away. No scandals, no dramatizing. You simply leave. Because when you stay in spaces where you aren't respected, saying nothing, you validate it. But when you leave calmly, you send a powerful message. I don't need to impose anything on you, but I choose not to stay where I'm not treated well. And that message, although uncomfortable at first, opens doors to change. My son's reaction? At first, silence, then a cold message, and later, on another call, his tone was different, more measured, less defensive. It wasn't magic. It didn't change overnight. But he understood that I was no longer willing to pay the price of mistreatment disguised as family. Here's the key. You don't need to yell to set boundaries. You need coherence, firmness, and self-love. If today you are tolerating disrespect for fear of losing the relationship, I want to tell you this. Respect isn't demanded. It's allowed or denied. And you have more power than you think. Not to change the other, but to decide how far you're willing to go. Sometimes the deepest way to love is to set boundaries that protect us. Dong. The results after applying the 4 rules. It would be easy to tell you that everything got better overnight. That after applying these 4 rules, my son ran to hug me, apologized for everything, and became the sweet child he once was. But no. The truth was different. And I think it's important you know. Changes did come, but slowly. With beautiful moments, yes, but also others that made me doubt. At first, when I stopped calling him every day, there was silence, and that silence hurt. I wondered if I was doing the right thing, if maybe I was pushing him away, if maybe I was the problem. But I took a deep breath, and I remembered, I'm not doing this to punish. I'm doing it because I deserve peace. A few days passed, and the first message arrived. A simple, "Are you okay?" And there I understood that my absence was starting to be noticed, in a different way. When I set boundaries for the first time, with firmness, without raising my voice, I noticed something I hadn't seen in years. My son looked at me differently, not with fear, not with anger, but with that mix of respect and surprise that comes when someone discovers you are no longer the same. Of course, there were also hard moments. There were days he replied coldly again, or when I noticed he was shutting down again. And I had to remind myself, this isn't a race, it's a journey. And on that journey, consistency was my best ally. Because when you stop begging, but keep the love, when you speak less, but with more truth, when you stop being emotionally dependent but remain available with dignity, and when you set boundaries without attacking, then everything changes. My son started texting me more often. His messages went from monosyllables to full sentences. Calls were no longer out of obligation, but genuine interest. And on a visit, he said something I will never forget. "I see you differently, more confident. I like seeing you like that." That day I cried. Not out of sadness. I cried because I finally understood something I took many years to learn. I didn't change him. I changed myself. And that changed everything. Because when you transform from within, the world around you starts moving too. Not always at the pace you want, nor with the words you expect, but it moves. Today, my relationship with my son isn't perfect, but it's more real, healthier, more reciprocal. And above all, I no longer feel dependent on his approval to have value, because I learned to value myself first, and that was the true miracle. If you're in that process, I want to tell you something from the heart. Hold on. Be consistent. Take care of yourself. Because when you change how you are in the relationship, the whole relationship has to adjust. And with time, it does. Maybe not how you expect, but in a way that gives you back something you should never have lost. Your dignity, your voice, your peace. And believe me, from there, everything gets better. We've reached the end of this path, and before we say goodbye, I want us to breathe together. Because if you've come this far, it's because something inside you deeply resonates with all this. And you're not alone. Today we talked about 4 simple rules, 4 decisions that, if applied with patience and self-love, can transform not only your relationship with your son or daughter, but your entire life. The first was, stop begging for attention. Because when you constantly chase someone who doesn't respond, not only do you push them away, you break inside. Learning to let go, give space, stop the chase, is the first step toward your emotional freedom. The second, find your voice without yelling. It's not about winning arguments, but about earning respect. And respect begins when you yourself embody it. Speak clearly, firmly, without raising your voice. Not to impose, but to affirm, this is who I am, this is what I deserve. The third rule was essential. Stop being emotionally dependent on your child. Your happiness, your peace, your self-esteem cannot depend on a message that never arrives or a promised visit that never happens. When you learn to nourish yourself from within, with friendships, hobbies, your own moments, you stop being a beggar and start being the owner of your life. And the fourth rule, learn to set boundaries without threats. A healthy limit doesn't shout, doesn't attack. It simply says, I'm here, but not at any cost. And that silent, firm, anger-free no has a power that transforms. Now, I know what you're feeling. That quiet pain of knowing you gave everything for a child, and now you feel invisible. That mix of sadness, anger, and guilt. That question that won't go away. What did I do wrong? I'll tell you something maybe no one has told you. Sometimes you did nothing wrong. Sometimes life, time, pride, or unhealed wounds cool the bonds. But that doesn't mean they're broken forever. It means they need rebuilding. And that rebuilding doesn't start with them. It starts with you. Because sometimes to recover a relationship, you first have to rebuild yourself. And that work, though not easy, is possible. I don't promise tomorrow everything will be different. But I promise that if you start today, something will begin to change. Maybe slowly, maybe quietly. But it will change. And now, I want to invite you to open your heart. Have you also felt that one of your children ignores you? What have you tried to change it? Tell me in the comments. I'll read you with attention and respect because your story matters. And if this message touched you, if you feel it can help someone else, please subscribe and share. Maybe there is another mother, another father, who today needs to hear exactly this. And you can be the bridge that brings them to this reflection. Thank you for being here. Thank you for giving yourself this space. And above all, thank you for not giving up on yourself. See you in the next video.